When we talk about what happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone, we have to begin much earlier than the moment of change. We have to go back to the moment the pattern was created. Because people pleasing is rarely a personality trait. It is usually a survival strategy. And like most survival strategies, it begins in childhood, in environments where being authentic did not always feel safe. Many empaths grow up in homes where emotional tension is high, where love feels unpredictable, or where approval must be earned rather than freely given. In those environments, the child learns something very quickly, not through words but through experience. They learn that harmony must be maintained at all costs. They learn that being agreeable keeps the peace. They learn that sensing other people's moods and adjusting to them is not just helpful, it is necessary. This is where the empathic nervous system becomes highly alert. The child becomes skilled at reading faces, tones of voice, small shifts in energy. Not because they want to manipulate anyone, but because their safety depends on knowing what is about to happen. If someone is upset, the child feels responsible. If someone is disappointed, the child feels guilty. If someone is angry, the child feels in danger, even if no one says a word. Over time, this sensitivity turns into identity. The empath becomes the one who understands everyone, the one who forgives quickly, the one who keeps the group together. They are praised for being mature, for being kind, for being selfless. And on the surface, these qualities look like strengths. In many ways, they are strengths. But underneath, there is often an invisible cost. Because when a child learns that love comes from being pleasing, they also learn that their real feelings are inconvenient. Their anger feels wrong. Their needs feel selfish. Their boundaries feel like rejection. So instead of expressing what they truly feel, they learn to adjust, to soften, to stay quiet, to make sure everyone else is comfortable first. This is the moment the pattern locks in. The empath does not decide to become a people pleaser. They become one because, at some point in their life, it worked, it protected them, it kept them connected. And the nervous system remembers what kept it safe. As adults, this pattern continues automatically. The empath says yes when they want to say no. They apologize even when they did nothing wrong. They carry emotional weight that does not belong to them. They feel responsible for other people's reactions, other people's moods, even other people's happiness. And for a long time, they do not question it, because this way of being feels normal. It feels like who they are. But eventually, something begins to crack. Not all at once and not dramatically. It starts as exhaustion. A quiet, deep exhaustion that does not go away with rest. The empath begins to notice that no matter how much they give, it never feels like enough. They notice that they are surrounded by people, yet they feel alone. They notice that they understand everyone, but very few people truly understand them. This is the first moment of awareness, and it can be unsettling. Because the empath starts to realize that what they thought was kindness may also have been fear. What they thought was love may also have been the need to be accepted. And what they thought was their personality may actually be a role they learned to play a very long time ago. And once that realization begins, it cannot easily be undone. Because the empath starts to see that pleasing everyone was never just about being nice. It was about staying safe. It was about staying connected. It was about making sure they would not be rejected, abandoned, or misunderstood. And the moment you see that clearly, something inside you starts to change, whether you are ready for it or not. And once that realization begins, it does not immediately bring clarity. In fact, what often comes first is confusion. Because the moment the empath starts to see their people-pleasing pattern for what it is, an inner conflict begins to form. A very deep one. On one side is the person they have always been. The one who keeps the peace, the one who understands, the one who makes things easier for everyone else. And on the other side is a quieter voice, one that has been ignored for years, that is starting to ask a very uncomfortable question: what about me? This is usually the stage where exhaustion becomes impossible to hide. Not just physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue. The empath starts to notice that their patience is shorter than it used to be. They feel irritated by things they once tolerated easily. They feel drained after conversations that they once handled without effort. And this can be frightening, because it does not fit the identity they have built their whole life around. They begin to think something is wrong with them. They wonder if they are becoming cold, selfish, or ungrateful. But what is actually happening is something much more honest. The nervous system is tired of living in constant adaptation. It is tired of scanning the room, reading everyone's emotions, adjusting itself to keep others comfortable. What once felt like kindness now feels like pressure. What once felt natural now feels forced. This is the moment when resentment can start to appear, and for many empaths, resentment feels like a forbidden emotion. They are not used to feeling angry. They are not used to feeling frustrated with the people they love. So when these feelings come up, they try to push them down. They tell themselves they should be more understanding, more patient, more compassionate. They go back to the old pattern, even when it hurts. But the mind and the body do not forget what they have learned. Once awareness begins, the old role no longer fits the same way. The empath starts to notice how often they say yes when they want to say no. They notice how often they listen but are never heard. They notice how often they carry emotional responsibility that was never theirs to carry. And every time this happens, the inner tension grows. This tension is the beginning of transformation, but it does not feel like transformation. It feels like guilt. It feels like confusion. It feels like losing yourself without knowing who you are becoming, because the empath is caught between two fears. The fear of continuing the pattern and the fear of breaking it. If they keep pleasing everyone, they feel exhausted and invisible. If they stop, they fear hurting people, disappointing people, or being rejected. And for someone whose identity was built around keeping connection at all costs, the possibility of rejection can feel almost unbearable. This is why many empaths stay in this conflict for a long time. They sense that something has to change, but they do not yet know how to change without feeling like they are betraying who they are. What makes this stage so important is that it forces the empath to face a truth they have avoided for years. They begin to see that constantly pleasing others did not always come from love. Sometimes it came from fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of abandonment. Fear of not being enough unless they were useful to someone else. And when you start to see that clearly, you cannot go back to not knowing. The role that once felt natural begins to feel heavy. The smile that once came automatically begins to feel forced. The empathy is still there, the care is still there, but something inside is no longer willing to disappear just to keep everyone else comfortable. This is the stage where the old identity starts to crack, even if nothing on the outside has changed yet. And when that crack appears, it quietly prepares the ground for a shift that will not only surprise the people around you, but may surprise you most of all. And when that crack appears, the shift does not stay internal for long. At some point, the change inside the empath begins to show on the outside, often in very small ways at first. They hesitate before saying yes. They take longer to respond. They stop explaining themselves so much. They may begin to set limits that, to them, feel completely reasonable. But to the people around them, those limits can feel unexpected, even unsettling. This is the moment when something very revealing happens. When the empath starts to change, other people start to react. Not always openly, not always aggressively, but noticeably. There may be confusion. There may be disappointment. Sometimes there is irritation, sometimes even anger. And the empath often does not understand why. From their perspective, they are simply trying to be honest for the first time. They are trying to stop abandoning themselves. Yet the response they receive makes it feel as if they have done something wrong. To understand this, we have to recognize that relationships tend to form patterns, and those patterns become comfortable for everyone involved, even when they are not healthy. When someone has spent years being the one who listens, the one who gives, the one who adapts, the people around them unconsciously learn to expect that role to continue. No one may have decided this out loud, but the dynamic settles into place. The empath becomes the emotional support, the peacemaker, the reliable one who will always understand. So when that person begins to step out of the role, the system feels the disturbance. People may not know why they feel uncomfortable, but they feel it. The one who was always available is suddenly less available. The one who always agreed now has opinions. The one who always absorbed tension now refuses to carry it. And even if the empath is being calm and respectful, the change itself can make others feel insecure. Some people will respond with subtle pressure. They may remind the empath of how they used to be. They may say things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore," and the tone often suggests that this change is a problem. Others may react with guilt, as if the empath setting a boundary is an act of rejection. And for the empath, this can be one of the hardest moments, because it touches the very fear that shaped their behavior in the first place, the fear of losing connection. This is why many empaths almost return to the old pattern at this stage. They see the discomfort in others, and their instinct is to fix it. They want to smooth things over, to reassure everyone, to go back to being the person who makes everything easy. Not because they truly want to, but because their nervous system learned long ago that harmony equals safety. But what they begin to understand, slowly and sometimes painfully, is that not every reaction from others is a sign that they are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is simply a sign that the relationship was built on a version of them that no longer exists. When you stop over-giving, the people who depended on your over-giving feel the loss. When you stop over-explaining, the people who were used to having access to all your thoughts feel shut out. When you stop carrying what was never yours, the weight has to fall somewhere else. And this can reveal a truth that is difficult to accept. Some connections were never as balanced as they appeared. Some closeness existed because the empath was willing to disappear a little in order to keep the bond intact. When that disappearing stops, the relationship has to change. Sometimes it becomes healthier. Sometimes it becomes distant. Sometimes it ends. And none of those outcomes mean the empath has failed. It simply means the dynamic can no longer survive in the form it once had. What makes this stage so powerful is that it forces the empath to choose between being liked and being real. For most of their life, those two things felt the same. Now they begin to see that they are not always the same at all. And the moment you realize that some people were comfortable with you, only when you were abandoning yourself, is the moment you begin to understand why this change feels so unsettling to everyone, not just to you. And after the empath begins to see how relationships change when they stop over-giving, another stage often follows, and this one can be even more difficult than the reactions from other people. This is the stage of guilt. Not ordinary guilt, but a deep, uncomfortable feeling that something inside has gone wrong. The empath starts to wonder if, in the process of protecting themselves, they have become someone they never wanted to be. This happens because their identity was built around being kind, patient, and understanding. For most of their life, they measured their worth by how much they could tolerate, how much they could forgive, how much they could carry without complaining. So when they begin to say no, when they begin to step back, when they stop fixing every emotional situation around them, it does not immediately feel like growth. It feels like failure. They may notice themselves feeling less available, less responsive, less eager to help. Situations that once pulled an automatic yes now create hesitation. Conversations that once lasted for hours now feel draining after minutes. And instead of recognizing this as a sign that their limits are finally being acknowledged, the empath often interprets it as proof that they are becoming cold. This is where the old conditioning speaks the loudest. A voice inside says you should be more understanding. You should be more patient. You should not make things about yourself. And because that voice has been there for so long, it sounds like truth. It sounds like morality. It sounds like the right thing to do. But if we look closely, what that voice is really defending is not kindness. It is the old survival pattern. It is the belief that connection must be earned by self-sacrifice. It is the belief that being loved depends on being useful, agreeable, and emotionally available at all times. When the empath starts to step out of that pattern, the nervous system reacts as if something dangerous is happening, even when nothing dangerous is actually there. This is why the guilt can feel so intense. The empath is not only changing behavior. They are challenging a rule they have lived by for years, sometimes for decades. A rule that said, if I stop pleasing people, I will lose them. If I disappoint them, I will be alone. If I choose myself, I will be rejected. And so they begin to question themselves constantly. They replay conversations in their mind. They wonder if they were too harsh, too distant, too selfish. They think about going back, apologizing, explaining, making everything smooth again. Not because they truly believe they were wrong, but because the discomfort of holding a boundary feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often feels unsafe. At this stage, many empaths believe they are losing their compassion. In reality, something much healthier is happening. They are learning the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. For most of their life, those two things were mixed together. They thought being loving meant always saying yes. They thought being a good person meant never making anyone uncomfortable. They thought empathy meant absorbing everything without limit. But real empathy does not require you to disappear. Real care does not demand that you ignore your own needs. And real connection cannot exist if one person is always adjusting while the other never has to. What makes this stage so challenging is that the empath is standing in new territory without a map. The old role no longer feels right, but the new one does not feel natural yet. There is a period where they feel unsure of who they are, not as agreeable as before, not as open as before, but not fully confident in their boundaries either. It is an in-between space, and in that space, guilt often tries to pull them back to what is familiar. But if they stay with the discomfort long enough, something important begins to become clear. They start to see that the guilt is not proof that they are doing something wrong. It is proof that they are doing something different. And for a person who has spent a lifetime measuring their worth by how comfortable others feel, doing something different can feel almost like breaking a rule that was never meant to be questioned. And the moment the empath realizes that setting a boundary does not make them cruel, that saying no does not make them selfish, that protecting their energy does not make them unloving, is the moment the guilt begins to lose its power and the real change quietly starts to take hold. And as the guilt begins to lose its grip, something else starts to emerge in its place. At first it is very subtle, almost easy to miss. The empath notices that they no longer feel the same urgency to explain themselves. Situations that once required long justifications, careful wording, and endless reassurance now feel different. They still care. They still think about other people's feelings, but the need to make everyone understand them completely begins to fade. For most of their life, the empath believed that harmony depended on being understood. If someone was upset with them, they felt responsible for fixing it. If someone misunderstood their intentions, they felt compelled to clarify every detail. If there was tension in the room, they felt it in their body, as if it were their job to make it disappear. Explaining became a way of keeping connection safe. The more they explained, the less likely they were to be rejected, or at least that is what the nervous system learned to believe. But after moving through the stages of exhaustion, conflict, reaction, and guilt, the empath begins to see something they could not see before. They start to realize that not every misunderstanding can be solved with more words. Not every relationship becomes healthy just because you try harder. And not every person truly wants to understand. Some only want you to stay the same. This realization can be both freeing and painful. Freeing because it removes the impossible responsibility of managing everyone else's emotions. Painful because it means accepting that some connections were held together only by the empath's effort. When they stop over-explaining, stop over-apologizing, stop over-adjusting, the relationship either finds a more honest balance, or it begins to fall apart. At this stage, the empath often becomes quieter, but not in a withdrawn or defeated way. It is a different kind of quiet. Before, their silence came from holding things in. Now their silence comes from not feeling the need to say everything. They begin to understand that they are allowed to have limits, without presenting a full argument for why those limits exist. They may notice themselves saying simple sentences that once felt impossible. I can't do that. I'm not comfortable with this. I need time to think. And then they stop talking. They do not rush to soften the message. They do not fill the space with explanations. They allow the other person to react however they react. This is not indifference. It is emotional independence, something the empath may have never experienced before. What changes here is not their ability to care, but their belief that caring means constant self-sacrifice. They begin to see that explaining everything was often an attempt to control how others saw them. If they could just say the right words, maybe no one would be disappointed. Maybe no one would leave. Maybe no one would be upset. But life does not work that way, and the empath slowly learns that other people's reactions are not always theirs to manage. This is a profound shift, because it moves them out of the role of emotional caretaker for everyone around them. They are still compassionate, still sensitive, still aware of what others feel. But they no longer believe they must fix every discomfort they sense. They allow space for disagreement. They allow space for distance. They allow space for the possibility that someone may not like their decision, and the world does not end when that happens. In many ways, this is the moment when the empath begins to feel their own strength for the first time. Not the strength of endurance, not the strength of tolerance, but the strength of being able to stand in their truth without needing constant approval. They realize that authenticity sometimes creates tension, but it also creates honesty, and honesty is the only place where real connection can exist. And once the empath understands that they do not need to explain themselves in order to deserve respect, something inside becomes steadier, quieter, and far less afraid, because they are no longer living to be accepted. They are finally learning how to live without abandoning themselves. And after all these stages, the awareness, the conflict, the reactions from others, the guilt, the gradual release of the need to explain, the empath arrives at a place that once would have felt impossible. It is not a dramatic transformation on the outside. In fact, to many people, it may look like the empath has simply become quieter, more distant, less emotional. But internally, something very different is happening. What is emerging is not coldness, it is stability. For most of their life, the empath's emotional state was closely tied to the people around them. If someone was upset, they felt it. If someone was disappointed, they carried it. If there was tension in the room, their body reacted as if they were responsible for resolving it. Their nervous system was always in motion, always adjusting, always trying to maintain connection. This constant adaptation created the illusion of closeness, but it also kept them from feeling solid within themselves. Now, as they stop pleasing everyone, that constant movement begins to settle. They start to notice that they do not react as quickly as before. Situations that once triggered anxiety now create observation instead. They listen, but they do not immediately absorb. They care, but they do not immediately take responsibility. There is space between what happens around them and what happens inside them, and that space changes everything. This is often the stage where people around the empath become the most confused. They may say, "You've changed," and for the first time, the empath does not rush to deny it. They have changed, but not in the way others assume. They have not lost their empathy. They have lost the belief that empathy requires self-abandonment. The calm that appears at this stage can be unsettling to those who were used to the old version of them. When the empath no longer reacts with urgency, no longer explains every decision, no longer bends to keep the peace, the dynamic shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. Some people will respect this change. Some will feel uncomfortable with it. Some may even try to pull the empath back into the old role, because that role made them feel secure. But the empath feels something different now. They feel the cost of going back. They know what it takes to return to that constant pleasing, that constant adjusting, that constant ignoring of their own needs. And once you have experienced what it feels like to stand in your own boundaries, even imperfectly, it becomes very difficult to pretend you do not know the difference. What also changes here is the relationship the empath has with their own emotions. Before, they often felt overwhelmed, not because they were weak, but because they were carrying too much that did not belong to them. Now their emotions become clearer, more grounded. They can feel compassion without drowning in it. They can care without losing themselves. They can be present without being responsible for everything. This is what real emotional maturity looks like, and it is often much quieter than people expect. It does not look like control. It does not look like hardness. It looks like steadiness. The empath becomes someone who can sit in discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. someone who can hear criticism without collapsing, someone who can say no without feeling the need to disappear afterward. And in this steadiness, something very powerful happens. The empath begins to attract different kinds of relationships. Not relationships built on how much they can give, but relationships built on mutual respect. Not connections that depend on them staying small, but connections that allow them to be fully present without losing themselves. This does not mean life becomes perfect. There will still be moments of doubt, moments of old habits trying to return, moments where the urge to please feels familiar and safe. But the difference now is awareness. They know what they are doing, and they know why. And that awareness makes it possible to choose differently. In the end, what happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone is not that they become less loving. It is that their love becomes honest. It is no longer driven by fear, no longer controlled by the need for approval, no longer shaped by the belief that their worth depends on keeping everyone happy. And when an empath reaches that point, they do not become cold, they become unshakable, because for the first time in their life, their kindness is no longer given to avoid losing others, but to honor the fact that they have finally stopped losing themselves.